You've released the report today, Tony Wood. Essentially, your focus on 2030. What you're saying is, and I've looked at this stat as well, the only reductions we get between now and 2030 is essentially all in the electricity sector, so no other industries are transitioning from here.
Yeah, that's exactly where we are, Tom, and I think it reflects good progress in the electricity sector, mostly driven by some policies that the Commonwealth government's had for a long time, which were effectively a price on emissions, and then state governments. That will continue, but electricity is a third of our emissions today. Under these projections, it will become a lot less, but nothing else is going down. And so if we're serious about net zero, we're going to have to engage with those other sectors, and waiting until technologies develop, which they will be necessary, is not going to cut it either. So we've just got to start engaging with those other sectors and using even existing policy instruments the government has at hand.
Right, we'll talk about them in a moment, but is it basically set up for another very easy meet and beat? That is, the projection from the government is not factoring in what other states are going to do. It doesn't seem to factor in a big shift to electric vehicles, if that happens. It doesn't seem to be factoring what a lot of companies are saying they'll do anyway. And if the coalition's still in power, even if they're not, they'll say, look, we smashed the target again. Is it sort of an artificially low-looking target to you?
Well, I guess we haven't got a new target yet. The government, I guess for some obvious reasons, in a sense, is committed to the existing target and will beat that, and that's good progress. It wouldn't be difficult to put a new target in place, say for 2035, that again, we would probably beat something like, 35 or 40% below 2005 levels by then. The really hard bit here is if the government starts to put in place new targets, then they're going to have to put in place new policies. And at the moment, the government's very uncomfortable with new policies. And the plan we saw announced last week doesn't have any new policies. It's just producing support for technology. So they've got to find a way through what is a very difficult, but I'd say self-inflicted minefield to get a way forward here. And we'll see how that goes yet, but it's not there yet.
One of the obvious ones is the safeguard mechanism. So you've spoken about this. What this is essentially the biggest emitters in the country at the moment. They're all on a list. They've all got a level at which if they emit carbon beyond that amount each year, they have to offset it, buy offsets. It's set so high, it doesn't really kick in for most companies. The issue here being, while a lot of companies might transition anyway, others that are on this list, if they don't transition, if they don't reduce emissions at all, suddenly what we're doing in one sector is undone by their behaviour.
Well, that's peculiar, Tom, and it's a good way to describe it, because it's called a safeguard mechanism, because the idea was to ensure that we didn't have emissions growing in these areas where you've got a small number of large companies, while at the same time, the government was paying for emissions in other sectors through its emissions reduction fund. And so the safeguard mechanism has never been an actually binding constraint on anybody. There's about 200 companies covered by this mechanism. Doesn't sound all that many, but they're big companies, and together they're responsible for about 130 million tonnes a year of Australia's emissions.
Yeah, and the ones that might be able to reduce electricity, well, that can be a win-win, but if they produce carbon in other ways, they either do it out of the goodness of the heart or they don't do it at all. The other one, vehicle emissions standards. What the government says on this, Tony, is, well, they don't want to touch this. It limits consumer options. It seems to be perhaps true somewhat today, but electric vehicles are obviously developing at a better rate, and there are also better fuel-efficient cars in the petrol variety still. Are we missing out on them? Has the government got a point around consumer limitations if they bring in this standard?
Well, I think the main reason the government would be concerned is that it would go against what they took to the last election when they were concerned about electric vehicles ruining the weekend. Now, what's changed since then is the range of electric vehicles, both in terms of the number of different models and how far they can travel. And so the idea this would ruin the weekend becomes a piece of history, and the government should find a way to move on from that, I think. The question here is going to be, well, if we don't introduce some vehicle emission standards, we will continue to get the rubbish vehicles that nobody else wants. We won't get the variety of models that our Australian consumers want with the range they can travel as well. If we introduce even a relatively modest emission standard and progressively tighten that over the next 15 years or so, then we would see the vehicles available We see electric vehicles available. And we'd also be making a contribution again towards net zero, because vehicles are a significant contributor to that net zero target.
Yep.
And again, if we don't start to make progress, we'll find it very hard later.
Transport, one of the sectors that's going up in the next few years. Just finally, Tony, look, we can talk about Australia. We know the big emitters, well, China's by far the biggest and India continues to grow. Given what they're saying right now about their emissions, do we need carbon capture and storage to work to have a good chance of limiting global warming? Because that's the only technology at the moment that really takes carbon out of the atmosphere if we go over our carbon budget.
Look, I think carbon capture and storage will have a role. It's been around for a while and it's still trying to find its home. It's almost like the ugly kid of the orphanage in a sense. I think the prospects of carbon capture and storage are most likely in areas where there's almost nothing else, as you say, Tom. For example, cement manufacturing. On the other hand, there are some technologies like soil carbon, which the government's very keen on, like planting trees, and even what's called direct air capture with carbon capture and storage, which may be part of that solution. So CCS works. The trick is, in most cases, it's too expensive, which means we're going to need policies to give people the incentive to pick it up. And that's where, again, we'd say, look, we need these government policies if any of these technologies are going to be deployed at scale, either domestically or internationally. And Australia really does need to think about how we do that as we try and move beyond where we are now.